Tulpa. Last year, I spent 6 months participating in what I was told was a psychological experiment. I found an ad in my local paper looking for imaginative people looking to make good money. And since it was the only ad that week that I was even remotely qualified for, I decided to give them a call and we arranged an interview. They told me that all I would have to do is stay in a room, alone, with sensors attached to my head to read my brain activity, and while I was there, I would visualize a double of myself. They called it my Tulpa. It seemed easy enough, and I agreed to do it as soon as they told me how much I would be paid. And the next day, I began. They brought me to a simple room, gave me a bed, then attached sensors to my head and hooked them into a little black box on the table beside me. They talked me through the process of visualizing my double again and explained that if I got bored or restless, instead of moving around, I should simply visualize my double moving around or try to interact with her and so on. The idea was to keep her with me the entire time I was in the room. I had trouble with it for the first few days, I won't lie. It was more controlled than any sort of daydreaming I've done before. I'd imagine my double for a few minutes, then grow distracted. But by the 4th day, I could manage to keep her present for the entire 6 hours, and they told me I was doing very well. The second week, they gave me a different room with wall-mounted speakers. They told me they wanted to see if I could still keep the Tulpa with me in spite of distracting stimuli. The music was discordant, ugly, and unsettling, and it made the process a little more difficult, but I managed nonetheless. The next week, they played even more unsettling music, punctuated with shrieks, feedback loops, what sounded like an old-school modem dialing up, and guttural voices speaking some foreign language. I just laughed it off. I was a pro by then. After about a month, I started to get bored. To liven things up, I started interacting with my doppelganger. We'd have conversations or play rock, paper, scissors, or I'd imagine her juggling or breakdancing or whatever caught my fancy. I asked the researchers if my foolishness would adversely affect their study, but they actually encouraged me. So we played and communicated, and that was fun for a while. And then it got a little strange. I was telling her about my first date one day, and she corrected me. I said my date was wearing a yellow top, and he told me that it was actually a green one. I thought about it for a second and realized she was right. It creeped me out, and after my shift that day, I talked to the researchers about it. "You're using the thought form to access your subconscious," they explained. "You knew on some level that you were wrong, and then you subconsciously corrected yourself." What had been creepy suddenly became really cool. I was talking to my subconscious. It took some practice, but I found that I could question my Tulpa and access all sorts of memories. I could make it quote whole pages of books I'd only ever read once, years before, or things I was taught and immediately forgot in high school. It was awesome. That was around the time I started calling up my double outside of the research center. Not often at first, but I was so used to imagining her by now that it almost seemed odd not to see her. So whenever I was bored, I'd visualize my double. Eventually, I started doing it almost all the time. It was amusing to take her along like an invisible friend. I imagined her when I was hanging out with friends or visiting my mom. I even brought her along on a date once. I didn't need to speak aloud to her, so I was able to carry out conversations with her and no one was the wiser. I know that sounds strange, but it was fun. Not only was she a walking repository of everything I knew and everything I had forgotten, she also seemed more in touch with me than even I was at times. She had an uncanny grasp on the intricacies of body language that I didn't even realize I was picking up on. For example, I thought the date I'd brought her along on was going badly, but she pointed out how he was laughing a little too hard at my jokes and leaning in towards me as I spoke, and a bunch of other subtle clues I wasn't consciously picking up on. I listened, and let's just say that date went very well. By the time I'd been at the research center for 4 months, she was with me constantly. The researchers approached me one day after my shift and asked me if I'd stopped visualizing her. I denied it, and they seemed pleased. I silently asked my double if she knew what prompted that, but she just shrugged it off. So I did too. I guess you could say I withdrew a little from the world at this point. I was having trouble relating to people. It seemed to me like they were so confused and unsure of themselves, while I had a manifestation of myself to confer with. It made socializing awkward. Nobody else seemed to be aware of the reasons behind their actions, why some things made them mad and others made them laugh. They didn't know what moved them, but I did. Or at least I could ask myself and get an answer. A friend confronted me one evening. She pounded at the door until I answered it and came in fuming and shouting up a storm. "You haven't answered when I have called you for freaking weeks, you jerk," she yelled. "What is your problem?" I was about to apologize to her and probably would have offered to hit the bars with her that night, but suddenly, my Tulpa grew furious. "Hit her," it said. And before I knew what I was doing, I had. I heard her nose break. She fell to the floor and came up swinging, and we beat each other up and down my apartment. I was more furious than I had ever been, and I was not merciful. I knocked her to the ground and gave her 2 savage kicks to the ribs. And that was when she fled, hunched over and sobbing. The police were by just a few minutes later, but I told them that she had been the instigator, and since she wasn't around to refute me, they just let me off with a warning. My Tulpa, meanwhile, was grinning the entire time. We spent the night crowing about my victory and sneering over how badly I'd beaten my friend. It wasn't until the next morning, when I was checking out my black eye and cut lip in the mirror, that I remembered what had set me off. My double. My double was the one who'd grown furious, not me. I'd been feeling guilty and a little ashamed, but she'd goaded me into a vicious fight with a concerned friend. She was present, of course, and knew my thoughts. "You don't need her anymore. You don't need anyone else," she told me, and I felt my skin crawl. I explained all this to the researchers who employed me, but they just laughed it off. "You can't be scared of something that you're imagining," one told me. My double stood behind him and nodded her head, then smirked at me. I tried to take their words to heart, but over the next few days I found myself growing more and more anxious around my Tulpa, and it seemed that she was changing. She looked taller and more menacing. Her eyes twinkled with mischief, and I saw malice in her constant smile. No job was worth losing my sanity over, I decided. If she was out of control, I would put her down. I was so used to her at that point that visualizing her was an automatic process, so I started trying my damnedest not to visualize her. It took a few days, but it did start to work somewhat. I could get rid of her for a few hours at a time, but every time she came back, she seemed worse. Her skin seemed ashen, her teeth more pointed. She hissed and gibbered and threatened and swore. The discordant music I'd been listening to for months seemed to accompany her everywhere. Even when I was at home, I'd relax and slip up, no longer concentrating on not seeing her, and there she'd be and that howling noise with her. I was still visiting the research center and spending my 6 hours there. I needed the money, and I thought they weren't aware that I was now actively not visualizing my Tulpa. But I was wrong. After my shift one day, about 5.5 months in, 2 impressively large men grabbed me and restrained me, and someone in a lab coat jabbed me with a hypodermic needle. I woke up from my stupor back in the room, strapped into the bed, music blaring, with my doppelganger standing over me, cackling. She hardly looked human anymore. Her features were twisted. Her eyes were sunken into their sockets and filmed over like a corpse's. She was so much taller than me, but hunched over. Her hands were twisted and knotted, and the fingernails were like talons. She was, in short, absolutely terrifying. I tried to will her away, but I just couldn't seem to concentrate. She giggled and tapped the IV in my arm. I thrashed in my restraints the best I could, but I could hardly move at all.
Whoa, they're pumping you full of the good stuff, I think. How's the mind? All fuzzy?
She leaned closer and closer as she spoke. I gagged. Her breath, it smelled like spoiled meat. I tried to focus, but I couldn't banish her. The next few weeks were terrible. Every so often, someone in a doctor's coat would come in and inject me with something or force-feed me a pill. They kept me dizzy and unfocused and sometimes left me hallucinating or delusional. My thought form was still present, constantly mocking. She interacted with or perhaps caused my delusions. I hallucinated that my mother was there, scolding me, and then she cut her throat and the blood showered me. It was so real. I could taste it. The doctors never spoke to me. I begged at times, screamed, hurled invectives, demanded answers. But they never spoke to me. They may have talked to my Tulpa, my personal monster, but I'm not sure. I was so doped and confused that it may have just been another delusion. But I remember them talking with her. I grew convinced that she was the real one and I was the thought form. She encouraged that line of thought at times, and then just mocked me at others. Another thing I pray was a delusion. She could touch me. More than that, she could hurt me. She'd poke and prod at me if she felt like I wasn't paying enough attention to her. Once, she jabbed me so hard between the ribs I thought I was going to black out and refused to stop until I said I loved her. Another time, she slashed my forearm with one of her talons. I still have the scar. Most days, I can convince myself that I just injured myself. I had hallucinated that she was responsible. Most days. Then, one day, while she was telling me a story about how she was going to gut everyone I loved, starting with my sister, she paused. A querulous look crossed her face and reached out and touched my head, like my mother used to when I was feverish. She stayed still for such a long time, and then just smiled.
All thoughts are creative,
she told me, and then just walked out the door. 3 hours later, I was given an injection and passed out. I woke unrestrained. Shaking, I made my way to the door and found it unlocked. I walked out into the empty hallway and then ran. I stumbled more than once, but I made it down the stairs and out the lot behind the building. There I collapsed, weeping like a child. I knew I had to keep moving, but I just couldn't manage it. I did get home eventually, though. I don't remember how. I locked the door and shoved a dresser against it and took a long, long shower and slept for a day and a half. But nobody came for me in the night, and nobody came the next day or the one after that. It was just over. I'd spent a week locked in that room against my will, but it had felt like a century. I had withdrawn so much from my life beforehand that nobody had even known I was missing. The police didn't find anything. The research center was completely empty when they searched it. The paper trail fell apart. The names I'd given were just aliases. Even the money I'd received was apparently untraceable. I recovered as much as one can from something like this. I don't leave the house much, and I have panic attacks when I do, and I cry a lot, and I don't sleep much, and my nightmares are terrible. It's over, I tell myself. I survived. I used the concentration those
monsters taught me to convince myself it works. Sometimes. Not today, though. 3 days ago, I got a phone call from my mother. There's been a tragedy. My sister's the latest victim in a spree of killings, the police say. The perpetrator mugs his victims and then guts them. The funeral was this afternoon. It was as lovely a service as a funeral can be, I suppose. I was a little distracted, though. All I could hear was music coming from somewhere distant. Discordant, unsettling stuff that sounds like feedback and shrieking and a modem dialing up. I hear it still. A little louder now.
Thanks for watching, and before you go, here's a special shout out to my patrons who donated $20 or more. Zestros, Jocelyn Cunningham, Fantasy Writer Cosplay, Dark Nido Taki, Avrok Levgri, Jesse, Kimimaro Kaguya, and Simon Leverdier Delisle. Thanks so much, you guys! If you're interested in becoming a patron and helping me to keep YouTube creepy, please feel free to check out the link in the card.